everyone, this is Becca from Becca's Music Room. I'm a music teacher who talks about teacher tips, teacher life, teacherpreneurs, and all things that might hopefully make your life just a little bit easier. Today I'm here to make your life easier by suggesting some books that you can read. So one of my absolute favorite series, I don't know, on my YouTube channel here is Becca's Bookshelf, where I just talk about all the books that I've been reading. So these are all books that I have been reading from January until now, and since I know that everyone has so much more time now that we are quarantined, I thought I would share. So we are going to hop right on in. So we're gonna hop right on in. All right, the first book that I have been reading, Classroom Management for Art, Music, and PE Teachers. So if you don't know, I'm a music teacher. Did I just say that? I don't remember. And I picked this book up, actually I read a different book. It was called Habits of Happy Teachers, or Happy Teacher Habits, something like that, by Michael Linson. And I'm gonna be honest, I had low expectations. I was kind of like, is this gonna be good or not? I don't know. But it was so good. So I picked up this one as well. They were both really cheap on Amazon, and it was so good. It was really short, and it would go through, and I mean, some of these chapters are like a page or two. And it goes straight from the beginning, and it talks about really specific things that you can do in order to make your classroom management even better. Based on this, I was implementing more of the strategies that he said, and then we have been online. So there's that. But it has helped, even just the little things that I was able to implement before we left, in just making sure that my classroom was well managed. So super practical, really good, highly recommend. Lots of good things, especially if you're a new teacher. But even if you're not, I've been teaching for 3 years, and I've read quite a few classroom management books and blog posts and all the things, and I still found this really helpful with like new information that I did not know. So highly recommend. The second book that I have read is called The 80-20 Principle. The 80-20 principle is about, well, the 80-20 principle. So if you've never heard of that, the 80-20 principle is basically the rule of nature, I guess, that pretty much everything that you do, 20% of what you do makes 80% of the results. And this is true in nearly every aspect of your life. 20% of the things that you do will bring you 80% of the happiness. 20% of the things you do at school are going to teach the kids 80% of the content. 20% of the things you do to clean your house is going to keep your house 80% cleaner. It applies to pretty much everything. And it's not necessarily, 80-20 every time, and even throughout the book he'll talk about 90-10 and just stuff like that. But basically the idea is there are very few things that actually make the biggest difference. I found this book really helpful and just really eye-opening as far as how to go through my activities and make sure what I'm doing is actually making a difference, and eliminate some of those activities that maybe I think make a difference but actually don't. So after I read this book, I went through and kind of analyzed different parts of my life, and in particular my business, and in particular my products, and went through and made some really interesting discoveries about what kind of products are selling. And it's very true that 20% of my products, actually probably even less than that, make me 80% of my profits. Went through, and because of that, I have actually kind of changed my product strategy to be a little bit more strategic in what I'm creating, instead of just creating all the things. Because if you have been around, then you know that I like to make all the things and do all the things. So the 80-20 principle was a really good book to help me make sure that I'm not doing all the things, but doing the things that make the most difference. So I would love to go really in depth into how I'm using this principle in my business. If you would be interested in that, leave it down below. Are feeling overwhelmed, if you feel like you don't manage time well, if you feel like things aren't making a difference, pick this book up, read it, and it'll make a difference. Also, I will give you permission to skip the first chapter, because the entire first chapter was about the 80-20 principle, and it was like a lot of graphics, and it was a lot of information, and it was a lot of like, seriously, I was like, I don't even know if I'm gonna finish reading this because I can't make it. But once I got to chapter 2, so much better. So Feel free to skip the first chapter because I just told you what the 80-20 principle is if you don't need convincing. But do pick this up if you would like to manage your time better or just anything. Speaking of managing your time better, the next book I picked up was called Eat That Frog by Brian Tracy. So if you've seen other videos like this, I have mentioned other books that Brian Tracy has written. I love his books. I love his principles. This one was not my favorite, to be honest. The reason is, I feel like this book was, it says 21 great ways to stop procrastinating and get more done in less time. So I felt like the 21 things that he mentioned in here, it was like, here's a couple of pages about this, here's a couple pages about this, here's a couple pages about this, which is great. Except that I've already read his other books that like go way more in depth into a lot of those things. So it was very much like, okay, I already know this. Okay, I already know this. Okay, I already know this. It was very much repeating itself. However, having said that, if you are struggling again with time management, this is the book I would recommend because it is a really quick overview of here's something really practical, here's something really practical, and they're all things that you can do immediately. Like you can read a chapter and do that tomorrow or even today and gain a little more of your time back. So if you are new to time management, pick this one up. If you have read other Brian Tracy books, don't bother because then you already know what it's gonna say. My next book was also kind of a dud. Y'all, I had a couple in a row that I was just like, ooh, okay. So the next thing I read was Emma by Jane Austen. So I know this looks gigantic, but this is 6 of Jane Austen's novels and not just Emma. So I have read Pride and Prejudice before, and that's the only Jane Austen I had read. I got this book for Christmas with all of them, and because Emma was coming out in, well, it was supposed to be in theater, I wanted to read the book so that I knew what to expect. And I liked Pride and Prejudice. I did not like Emma. It was not interesting. I really wanted to like it, but I just didn't. There wasn't a particular reason. I just felt like it was not very exciting. It was just like a lot of going to this person's house and talking and going to that person's house and talking. And y'all, literally, I would sometimes just skip a couple of pages and I didn't miss anything. Like I would start reading again 5 pages later and I'm like, I didn't even need to read those. I still know what's going on. So it would be a no on Emma from me, but you are welcome to read it yourself and see if you think something different. The next book I read was Mozart's Requiem. This is by Christoph Wolff, translated by Mary Whittle, and this is a really good one. So if you are a music-y person, if you love music history, I would recommend this book. It was very helpful. It's actually shorter than it looks because the whole end of it is the score to the Requiem. Like all of this is the Requiem score, so it's only about 170 pages, and it goes through and it has different articles from like when Mozart was around, and then articles from more recently, and just different perspectives on the Requiem. If you don't know, Mozart's Requiem is a really big deal because he was actually writing it when he died and never finished it. So his students finished it for him. So in this book, they go into like what parts are his, what parts are his students, what parts are like really genius Mozart, and what parts are things that Mozart borrowed from other composers. And just, it was really interesting in my super nerdy music way. I will say it was another disappointment because I picked it up because my community choir was singing the Mozart Requiem, and then quarantine happened, so we didn't get to sing the Mozart Requiem. So kind of disappointing because like our season got canceled, and I was like halfway through the book and I'm like, do I even finish it? I did finish it though, because it's like, well, I might as well. I'm sure I'll read it one day, or I'll sing it one day. After I had those disappointments of Eat That Frog and Emma, and then the Mozart Requiem, it's not its fault it was a disappointment. It was, you know, Corona's fault that it was a disappointment. I wanted to make sure that I was reading some things that I knew I was going to love. So I picked up some books by my favorite author, picked up like from my bookshelf. So the next thing I read was the book Nefertiti by Michelle Moran. I love historical fiction, first off. I blame that on the fact that I read a lot of American Girl books when I was a kid. I love Michelle Moran. I have literally every single one of her books. And I really, really, really love ancient history. I love just ancient civilizations are like my thing that I nerd out on. Specifically languages in ancient times and like how you can like see how people move based on how languages get transferred across the earth. And oh, I geek out on it so much. And also just like how many things are so extremely different from now when you read and you're like, what? Anyway, so all that to say, I love this book. And I knew I was gonna love it because I have read it at least once before, probably twice. But wonderful. So Nefertiti, if you don't know, is a really famous Nefertiti is a really famous Egyptian queen. She was married to Akhenaten. I'm not sure if that's correct, but that's how I say it in my head. It was an Egyptian pharaoh who actually convinced Egypt to turn against its gods and worship only one god, Aten, the sun god, which is really like a huge shift. After he died, the next few pharaohs got things back to normal. But because of just all of that, it is really fascinating to read like how all of that happens. And Nefertiti is the queen, so she is vying for being the chief wife. And so she's like trying to keep the pharaoh happy. She's trying to keep her position as chief wife. She's trying to keep all the people happy when like pharaoh's doing all these crazy things that all the people are like, you're doing what? Trying to keep all the viziers happy. Like, it is crazy, and it's just so good. It's one of those books you cannot put down. And even if you're not into history, it's a really good way to just kind of absorb some knowledge without realizing it. Love, love, love. Highly recommend whether you're into history or not. Really good book. Next up is a nice nerdy book, Enneagram Type 1. So I saw this book in Barnes & Noble and I was like, there's a whole book about one. If you hadn't guessed, I am a Type 1 on the Enneagram. So if you have no idea what I'm talking about, the Enneagram is a personality test that has actually been around since ancient Greece. And there are basically 9 different personality types, and then you can be kind of a combination of 2. And each one is very different. And then within each type, you can be, there's like a spectrum of how in line you are. So type 1, according to this book, is called the moral perfectionist. I don't know if I like how it says, but in the back it says conscientious, orderly, appropriate, ethical, and judgmental. I don't think I'm very judgmental. Maybe you would disagree. But the other ones I really, really, really relate to. So as I was reading this, I gained a lot of insight into kind of how my brain works and what that means and how I can, you know, kind of make sure that I'm staying on the healthy side of what's going on. And it's actually a journaling book, so you can see like I've written in some of these pages. And so it has like journal prompts at the end of each chapter and asks you questions that go along with the chapter that help you kind of dig deeper into yourself, which was really revealing as to like why I do certain things and why I think different things and just stuff like that. Now this year I have really kind of looked into things like personality types and reading about like my Enneagram number and stuff like that, because there's just been a series of things that made me realize that I do things that not everybody in the world does. And everybody does that because everyone comes from such different experiences and thinks differently. But if you are not aware of that, it's harder to understand people because you don't realize, oh, they don't think the same way that I do because we're 2 different people. And just really eye-opening for different things. Specifically things like I talk about, you know, having a list of ideas for blog posts that I write, and I talk about planning all the time because I love to plan. And it has occurred to me recently that not everybody loves to plan, and not everyone has this like ridiculous desire in their heart to do what they consider to be good, even to the point of like sometimes I'll get up and I'll, you know, tell my husband like, oh, I don't want to work out. And he's like, well, you don't have to. And I'm like, yes, I do. And I realized that's because I'm a 1. And the way that my brain works is I have to do what is good and what is right and what's gonna make progress all of the time. And so throughout reading and journaling and just really diving into this, it has helped me chill out a little bit, because I now recognize that a lot of the things I do because I feel like I have to do the right thing all the time, and I don't necessarily have to. That doesn't mean that I'm going to like sleep in all the time and never read and never do anything I should. It just means that I am giving myself permission to skip things if I feel like it, because I don't have to do everything. I hope that makes sense. So I found this book really helpful. There's one for all the different types. So it really helps me understand myself and also understand other people. The one thing I will say is this is from the like religious section in Barnes & Noble. Oh, remember when we used to be able to like go to Barnes & Noble? Good times, leaving the house. Anyway, so it is very, very Christian based. So if you are not into that, then you may not enjoy it as much. I am a Christian, so I did think that was fine. The next book I have is also Michelle Moran, and it is called The Heretic Queen. So this book is not really a sequel to Nefertiti, but it's kind of a sequel to Nefertiti. It's about Nefertiti's niece. And so Nefertiti died. Long story short, her niece was a princess at the palace with a whole new set of people who all thought that her aunt and her uncle and whole family basically were heretics because they had expelled all of the gods from Egypt and said, no, we're only going to worship Aten. So even though Nefertari, the main character in this one, did not believe that, she is kind of living with that reality of people associate her with her aunt and with her uncle and with just everything that went down there. And so this is a story of Nefertari becoming queen and people thinking she's a heretic queen, but she's not, and kind of like trying to convince people basically that she is an actually really good person and she's gonna make a really good queen. So I love this book. Really, really, really great. This is probably my favorite of Michelle Moran's books. The only caveat I will say is that the pharaoh in here is Ramses II, which if you are a Christian person, you will recognize that as the pharaoh who was around when Moses said, let my people go. And the timeline of events that she put in here is not what went down in the Bible. So if that is gonna bother you, don't read it. But for me, I just kind of was like, okay, I'm gonna separate this because it is fiction. So even though I believe what the Bible says, I'll just, you know, read it and not fuss. So it's a really good story as long as you just remember it's fiction and you don't get hung up on that detail. So there's that. But like, couldn't put it down. I think I read it in like 4 days. So also quarantine. And the last book I have to talk about today is a really good book for your mind, which we all need right now in quarantine, and that is Think and Grow Rich by Napoleon Hill. So this book is very, very famous. It is very well known, and it was very eye-opening. It is not actually like just sit and think and then you'll grow rich. Mostly knowing what you want out of life, whether that is riches or not, and being really determined to make that happen and getting rid of all of the excuses. So it talks a lot about mindset and how basically, like that quote, I think it's Henry Ford who said, whether you think you can or you think you can't, you're right. And so it was applying that to mostly money, but everything really, and has a lot of examples of really great people like Henry Ford, like Abraham Lincoln, a lot of those kind of people. I really liked this one. Also, I will say that it is interesting to read it this time because Napoleon Hill wrote this during the Great Depression, and which was after the Spanish influenza, and we are currently, as I'm filming this, going through the coronavirus where health is in jeopardy and the economy is crashing. So there were a lot of parallels in what he is saying and what is happening now, which I thought was just really interesting and just kind of happened because I happened to read it at this time. So I would really encourage you to read this, even if you're not like, oh, I need to grow rich. it's not necessary, it does talk about riches because that's what it is, but it's more about figuring out what you want and getting there and accomplishing things. Highly recommend, whether or not your goal is to become rich. All right, so those are 9 books that I have read recently, some of which I recommend, some of which I don't. I hope you enjoyed this video. Please leave any book recommendations you have down below, whether they are teaching books or just for fun books or business books, because clearly I read all the things in the world. So leave those down below. Thank you so much for watching all the way to the end, and have a wonderful